That was
perfect.
I don't think I could do it again.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know what? We'll actually have to try again next week. Sorry.
We'll have to try again next week.
This show's canceled.
Welcome into another episode of DNVR Avalanche at the Rink podcast, hosted by Meghan, Angley, and Jesse Montano. We're back with another At the Rink for you guys. We have a couple topics to get into. It feels hard to do this when the team has been on a road trip.
It also feels hard to do this when we're having to do this twice in a row. We already nailed the intro and weren't even recording.
That one wasn't as good. Yeah. Also,
the second one?
Yeah.
I thought it was good. I thought it was still fine, but yeah, the first one was clearly better. Yahir. But you know what? It's all right. No, Meghan, it's great to be back. We were both. You've been on the shelf a couple times here in the last month. It was a rough week for the beat last week. I want to apologize to everyone for the one post-game show I was on.
People were worried.
I was coughing so much. I missed. I didn't come on the show the next day for two reasons. One, my cough that night kept me up all night. It kept waking me up. Yeah. And I was still coughing the next day. So I was like, you know what? Clearly this is still an issue. So I'm not going to go try to fight through this. But the bigger reason was I listened back to the pod from the night before and I was like, I can't do this to people again. I'm not just going to be coughing in their ears for an hour again before and after the game. So it's nice to be back. Still a little nasally, but the cough is much more under control.
I'm so glad to hear it. You self-benched yourself.
Yeah.
One.
Self-awareness. You know what? You always got to be able to self-evaluate. And I took a step back and I was like, not good. Not good enough.
I love it. Self-evaluate is on a list of things we're going to be talking about today. But
Perfect.
I figured we'd knock out kind of the around the league news that really took up most of media this entire week. I think you already know what it is. It's Bruce Boudreau, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I want to spend quite a bit of time on this. But we were making the jokes before that there were sea shanties playing in here, and there's no way this isn't a sea shanty playing right now, right?
No, and I also wonder if the audio is picking up any bit of this.
And that's the only reason I'm drawing attention to it, because I was like, if anybody's hearing this in the background and we don't say anything about it, and we talk about Bruce Boudreau like we're not listening to like they're like scrubbing the decks downstairs. I just wanted to make sure that we are aware and equally as confused about what's happening if you can hear any of this.
Doesn't match the tone of this topic specifically.
It's you said it best as I know. It's weird vibes. Just
I like
weird
it for the
vibes
purpose of the Andreas Englund conversation. Something about that feels appropriate, which we are going to get into. But we'll start with the more somber news of this last week. Honestly, it's one of those, where were you when you first heard rumors stirring up in Vancouver? What was your initial reaction? Did you think he was truly on his way out, or did you view it as rumors just to start?
So let's take it a step further back. Last season, right? A horrible start for the Vancouver Canucks. Not what was expected internally, right? They felt pretty good about what they had in terms of personnel. You have Hughes, Pettersson, Bo Horvat, Brock Besser at the time, JT Miller, who, his future is a little bit up in the air. And then you felt pretty good about what you had going in net. Thatcher Demko was coming off a season where you'd really kind of surprised. And you felt like you had a legitimate number one goalie. You had a top pairing defenseman. And you had several good forwards. And not to mention, they just brought in a guy like Connor Garland, who I don't necessarily know if you want to call him depth. Once kind of viewed as a depth guy, now really looked at it as like a big offensive force. So you're feeling good. The season gets off to a terrible start under Travis Green. The Canucks were relatively quick to set the tone of, hey, this isn't acceptable. Travis Green was a little bit on the hot seat to begin with. They moved on and they brought in Bruce Boudreau. Bruce Boudreau breathes a breath of fresh life into the organization. They pick up some wins. They start off in this big winning streak. The Bruce, there it is. Mania kind of sweeps Vancouver, and everyone's feeling good. Well, they stumble down the stretch. They don't quite make the playoffs. And that was the first time I remember hearing people talk about Bruce Boudreau's job security. And I remember thinking it was weird. because he had come in and I thought had a really positive impact. And especially given the way the season started, I didn't really think there was any issue with them missing the playoffs, despite working themselves back into a situation where they had a chance to make it. So that was the first time I remember thinking it was a little odd. Well, they go through the offseason, make some really questionable moves, the biggest of which they decided not to move on from JT Miller at the deadline last year and instead extend him to a big money, big term deal in the summer. So I said, okay, well, to me, I looked at it as that this must be a vote of confidence in Bruce Boudreau. You're saying we're going to run it back. Well, they got off to a pretty similar start to the year as they did last year, And immediately, to answer your question, you started hearing the buzz about, is Bruce Boudreau on his... He's done. Is he on his way out? They're wanting to make a change. And I was like, whoa, that was a really fast change in tone in 9 months. Went from Bruce, there it is, this guy might be the savior, to, yeah, we need to get him out of here because the season started the same way that it did last year. And that has kind of brought us to this whole situation. So that's the answer to your question was, I remember hearing it at the end of last year and then immediately as things got off to a bad start this year and just finding all of that odd. And then it unfolded into everything that we've seen these last few months. And odd isn't anywhere near a big enough word for what we just witnessed with Bruce Boudreau.
It feels to like we talked about on other pods, a team looking for instant gratification.
Yep.
Wherein you can point to reasons why their season had the start that it did and why it was difficult for Vancouver to find their footing because of key injuries to key players that can't be helped, that can't be pinned on a coach alone. And it becomes harder to then understand why the leash that he was on was so short. You hear rumors of Rutherford not being high on Boudreau to begin with, and you hear that retroactively, though, so it's hard to know, has this always been the case, or are people saying this in hindsight now? Because what we're seeing in the public eye paraded in front of us this last week are a lot of players who spoke very highly about how he cares about his players, and that's what makes it difficult to understand where this disconnect and dissatisfaction came from.
So, to your point of the rumors about Rutherford not liking him, right? So that was to me where this went from, like I said a minute ago, odd to hold on. What else? What's happening here? This isn't just a weird situation anymore where they soured on a coach kind of quickly. Was there something here to begin with that got this relationship off to a bad start? And to me, what I think ultimately ended up feeling so bad about it was it felt like Bruce Boudreau was used, right? Where it felt like they half-heartedly brought him in last year because of that pressure again. You have to do something.
Right.
You have to do something. And you know, Megan, we talk about that because that's something that we hear a lot doing what we do, covering the team. We hear from fans of the team that say, God, I wish they would do something. They need to do anything. Someone needs to make a move. And you understand the urge to do that from the observer point of view, where I want them to make a move. I want them to do something that makes me feel better about the situation because something isn't stagnant. And stagnant can sometimes be confused for apathy, right? Well, they're not making a move, so they obviously don't care about what's happening. And it's typically, and this isn't unique to hockey, but it's typically the organizations and the general managers that can avoid the knee-jerk reaction and doing something to make themselves feel better in the moment. The ones that have the patience are typically the ones who you see winning championships and ending up with longer-term success because they understand that rash, quick moves in the vast majority of situations don't actually solve the problem. They just give the perception of I did something, so I'm not apathetic about the situation. I think you see in certain sports market and certain sports franchises, the pressure from the fan base gets to the management and they can't help themselves but to do things that ultimately set the organization back or don't actually move it forward. Again, I think there's examples that you see of that across the NFL, across the NBA, the MLB, but I think in the Canadian markets, in the NHL, you are a lot more prone to seeing that because the pressure is intensified. In Vancouver, they've never won a Stanley Cup. They've been very close multiple times. They've had Hall of Fame players, Hall of Fame player after Hall of Fame player come through, and they haven't been able to get over the hump. I think they thought they had a group that had the potential to do it last year, and when things didn't go well, they said, we need to make a change, and they brought in Bruce Boudreau because he was a coach with NHL experience who was available right now. And I think what we've learned is, I don't know if maliciously is the right word, but that they really never had long-term plans for him at all. And as we know now, they actually not only had a coach that they wanted to bring in, but they had an entire team of people that they've identified over the last number of months that they say, well, this is truly who we want at the helm. And what's so unfortunate about what they did with Bruce Boudreau is they essentially put this entire plan into motion behind the scenes. Not behind the scenes. They essentially put this plan into motion very publicly and trotted him out there every day with everybody knowing that he was walking towards the gallows every day, and they just wouldn't cut him loose. Whether it be... and actually, now that they did end up firing him, Meghan, I don't know why. I thought there had to be some type of like monetary reason behind the scenes. They're still paying Travis Green $2.75 million this year. I thought that we were seeing something where they were trying to get out of a certain window where they didn't have to pay him. They were trying to force his hand to quit so that he forfeited the remainder of that contract. Now that they've just fired him and they are going to pay him the $2 million that he's owed this year, what did you do this for? What did you drag this guy through the mud for months, publicly talking about how the team isn't good enough, there needs to be a change, major surgery? And again, not to mention interviewing all kinds of coaching candidates with the media knowing full well what you're doing.
Right.
I give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt on the last 2 weeks because maybe not. Rick Tocchet had to give 2 weeks, or was it longer?
4. I think it was 4 for TNT. And, we might not know the behind the scenes of if there were any exceptions to this, but it's compelling.
Right. So you say, okay, your new coach had to give an X number week notice before he could leave his current job, officially, publicly, even though everyone kind of knew what was going on. Okay. Why didn't you cut Bruce Boudreau loose and put in an interim? I just thought the way they handled it was so unbelievably inappropriate, let alone, just in general, let alone for professional sports. For the NHL, this is the highest level. You're supposed to be the most qualified general managers and owners and coaches and everybody, and you didn't have the respect for Bruce Boudreau to put in an interim coach when it was obvious that you were replacing him. Instead, you made him go out there every day and answer questions about him being replaced while he was still the coach. And then on top of that, holding press conferences, talking about how terrible the team is, how unacceptable it is, how you need major surgery to get it right. We have to change everything, blah, 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 blah. And then saying, well, Bruce is the coach for now. It's like, no, he's not. He's not. We know he's not. And for someone with the track record and the history of Bruce Boudreau, I just thought the insane lack of respect showed to him throughout this entire process was a huge pockmark on the Vancouver Canucks organization and their management in particular. I felt bad. The social media team posted a thank you, Bruce, with a nice message, and people were all in the comments like, it's not the social media team that did it.
Involved in this.
Right. But really, this was one of those things where I think it's going to take a long time for the public to regain any trust in what the Vancouver Canucks management is doing and their ability to handle situations. And I think they really damaged their reputation around the league, rightfully so, to the point where, honestly, if I'm a UFA, that is something that sticks in my head if I get a call from Vancouver, the way they treated Bruce Boudreau.
I think that's where we talk about culture in locker rooms, and this points to culture in a front office that absolutely has an effect on players. Players talked openly about how this affected their game. Players in Vancouver, Tyler Myers came forward. Curtis Lazar talked about how emotional the departure was for him. And Luke Shen talked about how kind of a coach Bruce Boudreau was, putting players' numbers on a whiteboard so that they had an open door to come talk to him and just let him know how life was going.
Yeah.
Andrew Cogliano had a really great quote talking about his experience under Boudreau. It's just, that is going to be something that players also recognize. You see the frustration on the Vancouver bench in leadership. You see JT Miller slamming his stick in frustration and Elias Pettersson rolling his eyes over the antics. There's just no leadership in that locker room.
Yep.
And there isn't something that a coaching change that is as reactionary as this is going to simply fix, because it is a toxicity that started in the front office. So there are a lot bigger problems that are going to carry on past this season, which you mentioned. It begs the question, then why now and why this way? This isn't going to revive the season for the Vancouver Canucks, and it has provided so many distractions. I don't know how they turn this around, no matter the leadership.
I'm with you, and look, we haven't even mentioned the fact that Adam Foote is going to be behind the bench for the Vancouver Canucks. So, you know, I don't know if they're maybe saying between Rick Tocchet, Adam Foote, and oh my gosh, another former NHLer. I can't think of who it is right now.
Sergei?
Yes. Is it Sergei Gonchar? Or
Gonchar?
Yeah, I think so.
I just don't think I had the pronunciation, so I didn't want to lead with what I thought the name was.
No. I'm pretty sure you're right. Regardless, they're bringing in, I think, guys that they are going to have to say, get in there and tear this down and rebuild it. You know,
you're right.
Culturally.
And we've seen an Avalanche team, not that I think
it is Sergei Gonchar, I'm sorry. Yes.
The culture was the same to build upon, but the Avs did have to sort of tear some things down and
reset expectations.
Start fresh, honestly, in a lot of ways, not just in core players, but even with a coaching change that they had to handle on the fly. So really different circumstances. So we've seen this done before. It was just executed so differently.
Right.
I don't know that the outcome can be the same.
Well, and so honestly, I think this season, and it's another thing that makes the JT Miller contract from last summer even more puzzling. Like, I really do think that you are looking at tank. You got to tank the rest of this year, and you have to start from the ground. You have to take it down to the studs in the locker room, and you have to completely rebuild the culture. And what Vancouver's management has fairly or unfairly done to this new coaching staff is you have to essentially tear this down and do a full retool, rebuild, whatever, internally in 38 games, because we need to be hitting the ground running next year. Because, Meghan, what happens if next year they come out and they lay another turd to start the year? What do? You've now made coaching changes in back-to-back years. You dragged the organization through their name and reputation through the mud this season in the name of making your coaching change. For me, honestly, if you knew the guys that you had in mind and they all wanted to be there, I would have, honestly, Meghan, I would have brought in maybe your two assistants and let Boudreau finish the year. If it's a throwaway year anyway,
right,
just let him finish the year. I don't like what to your, I don't know if this is necessarily your point, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like what's going to be worse about it? What's going to be worse about letting Bruce Boudreau finish the season, knowing that you're going to move on from him? Let the contract just run out. Why make him go out there and he's literally breaking down into tears on the bench 2 games in a row? Why do that to him?
The human level, right?
Right.
I think that's what people have taken issue with. And there are a lot of layers. Like, what can Tocchet bring? His most recent tenure in Arizona just was colored. It wasn't necessarily a glowing success.
Right.
And so for a team in the position that they're in, what difference does it make this season? It still begs the question. And we can start wrapping up this, but I want to give you the space to add any additional thoughts you have about it.
Well, I've really kind of dominated this conversation, so thank you.
No, it's okay. I think you've hit on, I don't think I had anything additional that I was trying to hit on.
It's just, to me, it really did kind of break down to, I think they should have cut him loose a month ago and put in an interim guy while they dealt with all the Tocchet stuff, or they should have just rode it out through the rest of the season. You're already clear the halfway point if you're the Vancouver Canucks. Bring Tocchet in as an associate coach. You know what I mean? I just didn't. I never felt like the way they handled this was at all appropriate. They had 3 or 4 opportunities where they could have done something different and made the right move that maybe would have been a little bit uncomfortable for them. But you know, Meghan, I think Vancouver ended up getting none of what they wanted out of this. It got horrible and uncomfortable. They really did a number on their reputation. They ended up having to pay Bruce Boudreau the rest of the money anyways. They ended up firing him in mid-season anyways. And he had a terrible experience on his way out. And the team, their results on the ice suffered. What did Vancouver get out of this? Where did they, as painful as it is, right? Because that's what's supposed to, painful decisions and painful situations are supposed to ultimately come out the other side, and you say, well, we got what we ultimately got what we wanted, even though we had to pay a price to get it. What did they get? They got the coach they were going to hire anyways. Cool, you were going to get that no matter what. What did Vancouver gain out of this? Nothing. It was only negatives for them. And you said it on the show, I think the other night after the Vancouver game, like, I imagine that's going to come back in some karmic justice, because that was just a terrible way to treat someone, let alone someone who is sacrificing what a coach, an NHL head coach sacrifices for your organization. Like I said, I can't figure out where the positive was for Vancouver.
I think you brought up a great point to wrap it up too. I do believe in things like restorative justice, and I do think this harms teams like Vegas when they circumvent the cap. I do believe these things because honestly, it's a symptom of a different problem, and the problem is trying to cut corners.
Yes.
You can't cut corners. And I think that is what is going to happen with Vancouver moving forward. They are going to face consequences for handling this in the way that they did, and they're going to pay for it over some span of time into the future.
My last 2 final thoughts here on this. We saw the Avs do this for years and years and years and years, and shortcut and shortcut and shortcut. And in a weird way, I almost think that 48-point season was kind of all of that catching up with them. It was a shame it fell on the lap of Jared Bednar. But genuinely, I don't know if Jared Bednar or Patrick Waugh make a huge difference in that season. That was the result of the organization trying to take those shortcuts and ultimately ending up with people who had different shortcut paths in mind and pulling the organization at the middle until it ripped. And that was what that 48-point season was. And thankfully for the Avalanche, you brought in an expert surgeon in Jared Bednar who was able to stitch it back together and turn it into a champion in 5 years. But I think that 48-point season was the catch-up of exactly what you just said, Meghan, an organization that tried to shortcut the right way of doing things too many times. And I know people roll their eyes when I talk about them on this show, but I think if you're here in Denver, you're seeing that right now with the Broncos, right? You made shortcut. You took shortcut after shortcut after shortcut at the quarterback position since they won the Super Bowl. It didn't work. You finally gave away all these assets for what you thought was going to be a set and forget superstar quarterback, and he has like the worst year of his career by 50,000 miles. And it's just one of those things where it's sometimes just sports Jesus saying, you can't take the shortcut. You got to do it right. And I think Vancouver has a healthy dose of that coming their way. And I don't say that
vindictively.
Right, vindictively. But I just think that's when you do things this way and you treat personnel a certain way, you end up with some of that. I lost the word that you just used that I thought was way better than karmaic.
Restorative.
Yes, restorative justice.
And it makes the wins feel better. I think the 48-point season is in perfect earmark to point to a cultural shift
100%.
that the current culture of this organization is built around. And I think a lot of that is ushered in with Bednar's tenure here.
Yes.
He's a coach who had a lot to prove to himself, too, at the NHL level. He had achieved success every level prior to it, but he was untested here, and he had a mess to clean up. There was a lot asked of him, and so I think that's why it is so important to him to maintain the culture of the locker room. I think that's why he's really adamant about every decision he makes. Every player that's in that room has to buy into the culture of this team, of this organization. And this is not the best segue for it, but there are still holes in this roster to fill. Mm-hmm. We are looking at trade deadline. That is something you talk about in your piece. And I really keyed in on the conversation for the seventh defenseman. Do they look inwards at an Andreas Englund, or do they look elsewhere in shopping for other options, like, is it, a Jonathan Taves package? I think it's an excellent suggestion. But I wanted to talk about what Andreas Englund has done, because I think he has made a compelling case for himself.
I agree.
I've jokingly said eighth man. I just don't know if I see him in the seventh man position. But he has room in this conversation because of what he's done. And I think it's fair to say that he fits the archetype of stay-at-home defenseman to a T. You are not looking to him for offensive contributions. But what I think he's done well has been a hybrid of what a Jack Johnson type brings to the table and a Curtis McDermott. He is physically imposing. He's difficult to play against. I think, all things considered, he needs a few more reps at the NHL level, more than he's already had. I think he's exceeded his game totals now in this season than he did in his last season in Ottawa. So he is working towards that. That's where I think this conversation favors someone like Jack Johnson. But positionally, haven't had too much effort with the defensive game he plays. Sometimes the mental decisions, like close guys out along the boards in the offensive zone, has led to some timing delays in getting back. But where I think he has an edge in this conversation is with his skating. Compared to a McDermott, even a Jack Johnson, I think he has a little bit more speed, and I think he's at minimum earned a right to be in this conversation.
And that is it right there for me, Megan, because I like what you said about maybe an 8th D type guy.
Right, I think I made that up. I don't know if that's real.
No. But I mean, seriously, I think that's where he more of truly is right now. You know what I mean? But I think coming into the season, there's maybe even a pod where we talk about all right, cool. No doubt on the shopping list is a 7th D, right? Come trade deadline, they're going to want a top 6 forward and a 7th D. Just looking at the way the roster was constructed, who you had in the American League, in Brad Hunt and in Andreas Englund, we said, you'll need a 7th D. You can't plug those guys in. As good as Brad Hunt has been in these last couple weeks, to me, it really has been Andreas Englund who's opened that door for, well, hold on. Do you need to spend an asset? Or do you have a guy internally that you say, if we need someone to come in and play the Jack Johnson role from last year's playoffs, Sam Girard goes down in round 2, you need a guy to step in nightly and hold his own. We don't need you to be, and I know I can already hear people we don't need you to be Sam Girard. We don't need you to be that level of effective. We need you to be passable. And we need you to play this role of third pairing defenseman, shutdown defenseman, killing penalties, blocking shots. We need you to do that well. And I think Andreas Englund, at bare minimum, at game, what are we in now, 44 tomorrow? 45?
I think we're at 45, maybe going into 46.
Yeah. Heading into that tomorrow, I'm sitting here and I'm saying, well, hold on, with 6 weeks plus to go till the deadline, I think you continue to give Andreas Englund a look here. And what I wrote about in the blog this week was where I'm at with it right now today, January 23rd, is if it costs you anything more than a 5th or 6th to bring in a guy like a Jack Johnson, Don't. You're fine. You don't need to be spending those assets when you're already an organization that's relatively asset poor right now. Relatively. You don't need to be spending those assets for a guy that will be at best a marginal upgrade purely in the experience department over Andreas Englund. Now, what I wrote about in there was I do like the idea that if you're going to go out and you're going to spend a third on Jonathan Toews, can you make it a second and get Jack Johnson as well?
Right.
Or can it be a third and Martin Kaut, a prospect that, regardless of how you feel about him, it's pretty evident that he doesn't have much of a future in Colorado. Can you upgrade your trade for Jonathan Toews by a fraction and get Jack Johnson thrown in? If they're doing that, I am all for it. And make Andreas Englund that 8th D. That if you get an injury in the playoffs and you go to Jack Johnson right away, well, you don't have to be married to Jack Johnson in that spot. That's my ideal for it. If you're bringing in a guy like Toews from a team like Chicago, add in your 7th D to that package and just get it done all at once. If it needs an additional deal, I am at the point, Meghan, where I'm saying I think Andreas Englund has done enough through 45 games in the year where I think that is a guy that's serviceable, that's passable, and like you said, his skating, I think, matches better of what this team would want to do in a playoff series. Curtis McDermott was available last playoffs, and they didn't go to him once. That's not meant to be a slight on Curtis McDermott, but like you said, I think you have a stronger skater in Andreas Englund, and that he would be a more realistic option to get some reps come playoff time if you need to dip into that pool. I just think his play has opened up the conversation of you maybe don't need 7th D on your shopping list.
And I think where this becomes really practical is in reflecting on the once risky decision with the goalie tandem. It was an affordable way to bring on Francouz Georgiev, and you're like, wow, they took a little bit of a risk there, but it was a calculated risk. They understand what they were hoping to get out of Georgiev. And this is where I view it in a similar light, that this is a front office that is watching Andreas Englund play right now, and they're evaluating the calculated risk here. If that really is then someone that they need to seek out hard around the deadline, or if they do have some flexibility there. And I get the impression that Bednar likes him as a player, generally speaking. I think that he plays a way that Bednar likes to see his players play, that I think he's earned a little bit of recognition there too. That I think it's completely feasible. And it's going to be interesting, though. I didn't know if you wanted to talk more about targeting someone like Toews, because it does feel like the need, in my opinion, is obviously second line center, but even just maybe a depth forward. Where are you at with that? I know Helm status being possibly out for the whole season has brought that into the conversation too, that they might need to be looking for some different positions to fill than we originally expected.
So the beginning of the season, I was kind of like with what you're talking about. Well, maybe a middle six guy. Let's not get carried away. Let's see what Alex Newhook does, right? Now as we have about 10 days till All-Star, and then after that, as we talk about in the blog, that's really trade deadline season.
Right.
Coming out of All-Star break, it is where are guys at? We've heard stories in the past. There's some sales jobs going on at All-Star weekend. Some of those bottom feeder teams that have to send representatives are definitely talking, to other guys that are there about teams and stuff like that. So the rumors really start picking up. We got into the bulk of the season, and I said they need a 2C. We're talking Bo Horvat, or maybe you need a clear top 6 guy. Bo Horvat, a Patrick Kane. Can you make Mikko Rantanen into a center if you do that other one? And you're going after a wing. But with the emergence of Evan Rodriguez, the more consistent play from Alex Newhook of late, I step back and I'm kind of back to where I was at the beginning of the season, Meghan. And that's why I didn't think that I would say these words 6 months ago. To me, it's Jonathan Toews. I think he makes the most sense for a few reasons. One, he's in control of where he wants to go. He's on record several times saying his hero is Joe Sakic. He wants to win again. He's not on board with what's happening in Chicago. I think he's going to look at the Colorado Avalanche and say, that's a spot that makes sense for me. There's talent there that I'm going to be able to play with if I'm in a top 6 role. That'll far exceed what I've had a chance to play with in the last several seasons. I think he's a cultural fit. He is the archetype of leader, team first kind of guy. He's captained 3 Stanley Cup championship teams. Clearly, he knows what it takes to win. He knows what it takes to go through one of those runs, the mental and physical grind of going deep into the playoffs year after year and what it takes to take care of his body. And then one of the last things is what you just mentioned. You can drop him in as your second line center to start. And I'm just going to spitball here. You could do any level of combination. You could run back that Stanley Cup final line that we saw that worked so well of Nichushkin, McKinnon, Landeskog. And then you could run Rantanen, Taves, Lehkonen, with Rantanen really showing his emergence as a standalone superstar this year. You could keep McKinnon and Rantanen together, McKinnon, Rantanen, Lehkonen, and you could put Nichushkin and Landeskog with Taves as a true kind of shutdown line. You can put Nichushkin and Rantanen with Taves and give you that kind of heavy grinding with a guy like Rantanen who can be your trigger man on that line. Or if you are really loving the way that Evan Rodriguez continues to look next to Nathan McKinnon, you could keep Rodriguez and McKinnon together. You could put Landeskog back on that line. You could go Lehkonen, Rantanen, Nichushkin. And now suddenly you're staring at a third line of Newhook, Taves, Comfort. And suddenly you have a Nathan McKinnon line, a Mikko Rantanen line, and then in your bottom 6, a Jonathan Taves line. And there is that depth that we talked about so much last year that we have said is missing from this team. To me, it's the flexibility that Jonathan Taves is going to get you, and he's just going to cost less. He's just going to cost less than a Bo Horvat. You'll be able to get half the salary retained. You can make the money work. If you have to get a team like Arizona involved to eat a little bit more, you can do that. I just think that this is a guy that gives you flexibility in your top 9. You can move Newhook into the middle, or if you like him better on the wing, or whatever. He just gives you too much flexibility that I think that not going with a player that offers you, even if it's not Jonathan Taves, that offers you that type of, we can move him up and down. I think anybody that, it's not worth going after somebody if they can't give you that. If you're bringing in a guy that's like, we have to plug him in here or it doesn't work, to me, I just don't think you're at a point this season where you should be trading top prospects and first round picks for a guy like Bo Horvat. I think Jonathan Taves accomplishes something similar. It gives you your depth back for way less in terms of cost.
I had so many tangents I wanted to take this off of. One, we targeted the All-Star game break in the Gabriel Landeskog conversation. If he returns around this time, then he should get in some games before the end of the season. We are really nearing that date, and we don't really have an update on Landeskog. Just real quickly, how are you feeling about that? Are you envisioning him coming back to the Avs in the regular season, or does it point more towards shutting him down, bringing him back in the playoffs?
I'm sorry, there's a bad answer. I'm going to stick with our original timeline
after All-Star game break.
All-Star. And that's all going to depend on what we are hearing out of the organization.
Right.
If it's, yes, he's finally making some significant strides, then I'll say that they get him in some regular season games. But if it's still, we'll see, then I do think come, 10-ish days from now, if we are still at we'll see, I think that is kind of them saying we're shutting him down till playoffs. Because he is on LTIR right now, but they are not treating that as if they have that space right now today.
And off the cuff, and nobody hold him to this, is there a dark horse trade deadline candidate that you could see making sense? It doesn't even need to fill a 2C position specifically, just a name that has been in the back of your mind.
in the back of my mind.
The reason it'd be fun too is like if this comes to fruition, you can point to this podcast and say, you know what? I thought that might happen.
So I'm actually going to point to something that I used in the mailbag from a couple weeks ago. And this is dark horse. It's Kevin Hayes out of Philly. Okay. It's a guy at the Avs have liked for years and years and years. They've tried to get him through trade, through free agency, and things have not gone well under the current coaching regime in Philly. And I talked about it in the mailbag a couple weeks ago. He's a second line center with good offensive upside. That to me is a guy that he's got term beyond this year. That if the Avs were going to say, you know, we want to do something bold and solve some problems beyond this season and maybe move a contract out to bring one back that will be here longer term.
Right.
Kevin Hayes is a guy that it's just, like you said, it's just one of those names. I've heard nothing. I've reached out to some people about it. No one, this isn't really anything that's generating buzz, but it's a name that I think is too perfect of a fit and the circumstances are aligning a little bit too well. Like I can't get the name out of my head.
No, I do love that. I think it's a front office that has surprised me, even looking at last deadline. Arturi Lehkonen was not a name that I personally had in my queue, and that was a really great acquisition.
Another example of a guy that they had looked at in the past. And that's another reason that I keep coming back to Kevin Hayes. This organization has a good track record of revisiting guys.
I think that's something to consider. And you talked about the importance of flexibility right now. Somebody that is in the At the Rink piece is Ben Meyers. I wanted to talk about the position that he's in presently with the team, what we're seeing in him, because I have a complicated evaluation of Ben Meyers, the player. I still have hope that he can be a depth player that does add flexibility to this lineup moving forward. But there have been some unexpected parts of his game, and it's just the lack of offense.
Yeah.
I think that's been difficult, but there's a few things I want to point out too. One, that we see that he's creating chances. The other part of that too is when he was initially reassigned to Loveland, he was given a directive to focus on the defensive side of his game because they were really keen to get him at center up with the Avalanche later in the season. When you look at his numbers in Loveland, they don't jump off the table at you offensively because that wasn't his area of focus there. Now that he's been back up with the Avs, I think this is an area where you can say that he has improved his game, and you're then just left wanting a little bit from him offensively. And we did talk with him about working through the scoring woes that he's dealing with right now, and he had a really pragmatic response.
You know, I've just kept getting better. Obviously, I think, I still think there's so much more to my game that I can add and help this team win. And I just haven't produced offensively, but like I said, I think there's just so much more for me that I can give to this team, and I'm working every day to do that. So that's just the key for anybody, is to generate chances, and it's just part of the game. I've never gone through a stretch like this before, but also, I wouldn't say I'm frustrated, but obviously I want to do more and find a way to get on the score sheet too. So.
Ben Meyers.
Yep.
It seems like he's a really good head on his shoulders, a maturity to him. He had a captaincy in college. Like, he even points out that he hasn't gone through a stretch like this before, so he is learning a lot about himself as a player.
You like the confidence and not like the overwhelming confidence, but the fact that he's not frustrated by it, right? We talked about that with this team just in general, relative to like the losses. The fact that it seemed like they weren't ever doubting themselves still, despite, that rough streak that they went through a couple weeks ago. Feels the same with Ben Meyers. Not doubting himself, right? He's saying it's frustrating, it's tough, I've never gone through this, but I'll be all right. I think it's frustrating for us to watch, or not frustrating is not the right word. It's interesting for us to watch because he came in last year, and what was his one major contribution in the few games he played? A goal.
An NHL debut goal.
An NHL debut goal where it was a repeatable type of goal, right? It's not like he walked off the wall, toe dragged a guy, then, delayed, pulled to his backhand and threw it shelf. Like, no, he was doing things right. Skating hard, crashing the net, coming down the slot, following pucks to the net, picked up a rebound and, got good wood on it. And It was something that you're like, wow, that's what you wanted him to see. That's what he brought in college, right? Hard nose for the net and da-da-da-da-da. You were excited about that. Comes out early this year, scores a goal early in the season.
A weird one.
And you're like, see, look, that's what he earns that though, right? He earns the weird goal because he goes to the hard areas. And it just seems like a lot of that has dried up. He's gotten himself in some areas to contribute. But it just seems like that hard-nosed pop in the offensive zone that we saw out of him last year and that one game early this year, that's not there for me in the same way. It's not to say he's been bad. I think his game does look a little bit more well-rounded. And again, he's a young kid playing in his first year. It's a big jump to go from college to the NHL. I think he'll get there, but I think part of what leads to it feeling a little disappointing is how good he looked in those 5 games last year. Now, again, you keep in mind, he's coming off of the Frozen Four, playing at the highest level he's ever had to play, the quickest pace he's ever had to play. So jumping straight into an NHL game probably felt a little bit more natural to him because he was already playing at such an elevated pace for going through the tournament at the college level. But I think now this being his first season, it's a longer season, it's more games, it's more of a daily commitment. The practices are a little bit more intense. The meetings are a little bit more refined. I think this is his learning curve, and I just think it's been a little bit harsher of a curve than we were expecting.
I'm going to monologue just for a second, too, about...
I'm pushing the mic away. I want you to.
No, my overall thoughts about Ben Meyers so far, because there are things that he's doing well and trust being built between him and Bednar that I appreciate seeing. You talk about him getting to the dangerous areas. He is still continuing to do this. And when you see him creating, it is when he drives to the slot, and he is a player I think they want to be a crash the crease type player. He's sturdy, but Bednar called him out for being a little bit lighter on his feet this time around, and I also want to call out that he does look like he has a little bit more speed, especially cutting up ice through the neutral zone in transition. That is where I do see that he has a little bit more quickness to his game that has benefited him. And then the tricky part then is that sturdiness I talk about in him being this net front presence isn't translating into the board battles for me. That's where I'm seeing him get outbodied, outworked, and he is coming from a league where he did play among younger, smaller players to some extent, and now he's playing among men. And I think that he is trying to find a way to be light in his skates when he needs to be fast, but sturdy on his feet when he needs to win those board battles. And I think that is where you see him fall short a little bit. But again, he is creating chances of the call-ups. I think he has the best shooting percentage behind Brad Hunt, which is honestly not a great call-out because some of these other prospects just didn't move the needle. But he is out there creating chances. You see him working hard on those optional practice days, fine-tuning the details of his game. I think he's on the brink of something, but it's hard because he doesn't just need to be a goal scorer. You'd like to see him be a part of playmaking, if not all else. And then where you see the trust being built, as I mentioned before, he's out in the final seconds of a 1-goal game, right? When they pull the man advantage on, I want to say it was the LA game. And he has trust to be out there on the ice for those moments. And I think that's huge for such a young player. And then the other part of it is the looks that he's getting on PP2. Again, that net front player, I can see the vision that they have for him. He hasn't quite stepped through the doorway into the player that he's meant to become. Yeah. And I don't have a criticism of the timeline. I just think it's probably not exactly what they would have hoped for him. But I am seeing progress. Yeah. And I think that's where I'm encouraged with Meyers and where I'm really hoping that he breaks through and just gets on the score sheet. Like, it doesn't need to be a goal. I'd like to see him assist in setting up play and
get rewarded for the hard work.
Exactly, because he is working hard. In the same way that I think Newhook hasn't always been put in the best position to succeed because of the injuries, some of who these players are playing alongside are the AHL call-up types. And to an extent, Meyers is an AHL call-up type, but it's going to be difficult to see a Newhook or a Meyers succeed if they are constantly changing line mates. Basically, there's a lot going on that I'm still hopeful for him. And I really like, especially these last stretch of games, I have seen him creating chances. Even this most recent Is it the Seattle game? He had a terrific chance. Ottawa game, he was behind a lot of great chances. I'm just hopeful.
I want to see him. My goal and hope for Ben Meyers the rest of this season. I want to see him. We mentioned Darren Helm's status being uncertain.
Yes.
Embrace the Darren Helm role. This team is not asking you to be a top 6 forward right now. They may in the future. That may be in the cards for Ben Meyers, a top 6, middle 6. This year, the way Ben Meyers is going to be the most effective is being Darren Helm. Skate guys into the ground and go to the net. And you're going to put yourselves in situations. He's got some decent skill. He's going to put himself in a situation to find the score sheet. I want to see him. We talked about what the lines could look like after a trade deadline, whether it's Jonathan Taves or not, right? The line we didn't mention there was the 4th line. You have a chance of that 4th line being Logan O'Connor, Ben Meyers, Andrew Cogliano. We've seen what that line, that combination has done for Alex Newhook in the last few days. I want to see it do that for Ben Meyers. Understand the effort, get to the hard areas, and you are going to get your chances. Embrace that role, own it for the rest of this year, and be the best 4th line center in the league. And it's going to do wonders for him, and he's going to get looks next year.
When we sat down to do this podcast, I felt like we're like, oh man, what audio are we going to include? Do we have enough to talk about? And we haven't even talked about Nathan MacKinnon going to the All-Star game and the pace that he appears to be at. Like, I don't even want to say it out loud and jinx it from happening, but you know what I'm alluding to.
Yep.
So I think I'll have us wrap it up here.
Yep.
And we could put a pin in the MacKinnon conversation, and we'll just circle back to some of these topics in our next At the Rink podcast.
We'll be into the bye come next week's At the Rink podcast, so we will need the content. So we'll save it on for next week. But I do think it is important that we get to Nathan MacKinnon next week because this All-Star appearance for him, I actually think has created a really interesting conversation about who he is as a player. If you don't want to wait till next week, I wrote about it this week in the blog, so you can go check it out. But I do want to get your thoughts on it as well, because I think it is just fascinating.
I'm really excited to talk about that. We also have to go to practice right now. Yeah. So thank you guys so much for tuning in to DNVR Avalanche podcast At the Rink. Meghan, Angley, Jesse Montano. We'll see you next time.